Kamusta kayo dyan? Happy Valentine's Day! Yung mga natin dyan, mga ka-QC girls and boys, kamusta kayo dyan? Mga single, double, kung ano man kayo dyan, I hope you're doing well. Eto na, nagpakita na naman ako ng konti. Lumabas na naman ako sa cave virtually, no? Umahabol ako sa dami kong paperwork and mga trabaho. Sabi natin, medyo konting mag-analysis tayo dito. Lalong-lalo na may mga bagong surveys na lumabas. Hindi lang yung isa na binabash ngayon. May mga iba't ibang surveys. I-analyze natin yung trend line sa ating elections. And of course, nako po, mukhang ang daming nagpakita kahapon dyan sa QC Circle. May pink wave tayo, ha? Ibang klase, ha? Nakita ko dito yung mga pictures. Grabe, oh! Talagang pink na pink yung wave, oh. Ibang klase. Makikita mo talaga yung enthusiasm ng tao dito pa sa QC Circle. At si Mayor, kamusta naman kayo dyan, Mayor? Kahit isang tang juice, di tayo nagbigay ng ayuda dito sa amin, ha. Talagang wala tayong nakuha kahit isang, talagang kahit juice, wala. Ayudang nakuha. But anyway, mukhang sumama nakita natin yung video ni Mayor Belmonte, Joy, diba? With Vice President, and kita talaga natin si Vice President going through this pink wave. Daming tao, very excited, despite all the, complications of the pandemic. Nakikita natin na maraming tao talaga nagpapakita dyan, no? Nagpapakita talaga dyan to show support for the leader of the opposition, liberal opposition. So in fairness, makikita natin na mukhang honestly, yung level of excitement na nakita ko dyan is, sa tingin ko of course, hindi ako nag-attend. I mean, non-partisan tayo. Pero yung nakita natin from aerial footage ay mas malaki, I would say, than 2016. No offense, no? And more like 2010, no? So in many ways, pwede mong sabihin na si Leni Robredo talaga ngayon ang lumabas na the new generation of leadership pagdating sa liberal opposition, no? So the transition, I think, has already happened. Now, at the same time, alam ko maraming galit dyan sa some of the news service that came out that kinda na parang ni-reinforce yung Tony Talks na claim, no? Anong sinabi nung na yan? Sabi niya, tapos ng laban or something like that. Kasi, of course, mukhang based on some of the surveys, hindi lang commanding lead, but mukhang prohibitive lead na meron na si BBM, no? At si Sara Duterte, mukhang dumodoble na siya almost kay Tito Soto. So, you have a significant change in the dynamic. So, the unit team, hindi ako magsabi na. Yung unit team ay medyo in a very good position ngayon. Kaya ang daming mga nagsasabi, credible ba itong mga survey na to? Or yung ba nagsasabi, ay, inevitable na yan, panalo na, tapos ng laban. Nasaan po tayo? Kamusta ang race natin? So, let us talk about a number of issues, and we're gonna go through the numbers, so please bear with me because we have to have, you see, you cannot win democratic elections, you cannot come to power if you refuse to confront certain facts and you want to just rely on wishful thinking. Hindi po pwede. That's not how you run modern world, no? Although alam natin may mga populist and mga dyan na gusto naman nila alternative universe. So we'll have to talk about that, and I'll talk about a number of data there, which actually shows a relatively more ambivalent picture than yung inevitability of a unit team victory, no? As much as, of course, medyo may commanding lead talaga. So please, yung mga iba dyan, wag bitter sa mga surveys, wag atakein yung mga surveys na yan. Lalo na yung mga authoritative established surveys po. May siyensya po dyan. So we're gonna talk about SWS, we're talking about Pulse Asia, we'll talk about also an authoritative survey also done by a good friend of ours, who has a PhD in political science. Actually, dalawa sila, academics involved in this study. So pag-aaralan natin lahat yan, no, para maintindihan natin ano yung nangyari. First of all, let me put it this way. Dapat, we have to be honest about this. This is not just any other presidential elections. We are in a different scenario altogether from all the past, I would say, 5 or 6 presidential elections we have had. The ground has already shifted, no? And let me explain to you how, on 3 levels. First of all, nakita natin nung 2019, no, na it's actually possible for the administration to pull off a total clean sweep, diba? Nakita natin yung opposition for the first time in more than 80 years was not able to even win a single seat in the Senate in 2019 elections. Now, we can analyze what happened, what went wrong. And of course, one of the points that has been raised is whether the election was as competitive and as fair, whether the opposition had sufficient opportunity to properly campaign. Naharas ba sila? Or yung mga LGUs nag-host sa kanila, nagharas ba? So there are many arguments being thrown out there. No? But the reality is 2019 showed that actually this administration especially can pull off a clean sweep. No? So there is a precedence for something out of this world. Because usually, you know, the midterm elections ay nagfe-favor sa administration, but the opposition tends to pick up, let's say, 1/3 of the votes or something like that. So it tends to do pretty okay. Even during the time of President Aquino, who was very popular, 2013, still the opposition was able to pull off here and there. So what happened in 2019? So that tells us that something is changing. That the whole coordinates of political competition is changing. The second thing we have to keep in mind is this. Hindi ako nagsasabi yan, pero may nagkikritics na nagsasabi na maybe the guardrails of the elections itself has to be scrutinized. For instance, look at how COMELEC handled the disqualification cases against Bongbong Marcos. Now, I'm not a legal expert, I'm not an election law expert, so I'm not in a position to give a kind of a definitive legal analysis. But we know very well that a lot of lawyers, a lot of experts, high-level experts, have questioned, including a former senior commissioner, retired senior commissioner in COMELEC, and a question dun sa circumstances and also the content behind the dismissal of the disqualification case against BBM. So critics would say na mukhang the ground has not only shifted but shifted really in favor of we know which camp. No? So is this just another competitive elections, or is this something else we're talking about? Again, I'm not in a position to throw a definitive judgment, but this is what some people are saying. On the third level, as I've argued, this is nothing short of a counter-revolution. In many ways, the Marcoses are now in a position whereby they really want to essentially erase what happened in 1986 and revitalize and not only rehabilitate, revitalize and restore. No, this is a restorationist project. No, yung Marcos style of governance. Now, that doesn't mean na martial law and all of that. That's not gonna happen because we are in a very different context. But disparaging of the 1986 revolution, questioning its validity, questioning the leaders who led it, that's going to be one of the central themes of any prospective Marcos presidency. And you can see where it can go from there. Now, maaga pa para pag-usapan yung potential scenarios under a Marcos 2.0. I think that will be prejudicial to this race because the race is still there, right? Which brings me to the second part of our discussion. Ayan, bago niya ako i-bash, no? Ayan na, mababash na ako from both sides. Now, let's go to the other part. Again, let me talk about, let's say, three things, no? Wala tayong notes, but let me just pull off some numbers here. The first thing I want to talk about is this. Extreme variability dun sa support base ni Bongbong Marcos. Let's not forget, just over 2 quarters ago, no, when Tatay Duterte and Sara Duterte were the winning tandem, Bongbong Marcos was only 13%. And he was number 3, even behind ISKO. Only 13%. So dun sa mga nagsabi na solid ang base ni BBM na ganito 20, 30, 40, 50, I'm not sure about that. Because we saw that he was only at 13% just over 2 quarters ago. So how do you explain his jump to 50 and some would even say 60% now, right? And that is where clearly there's a Sara all effect going on there, right? There's a nationwide bandwagon happening there, and a lot of that is actually Mindanao. Not only Mindanao solely, but of course a lot of that is Mindanao. Parang nangyari is biglang nag-super saiyan ng ano, tapos biglang nag-bandwagon lalo yung iba, di ba? So let me just give you some numbers, right? I mean, for instance, just look at the latest Pulse Asia survey. In terms of mega geographic base, hindi lang yung sub-regions, actually, Bongbong Marcos gets the most support. It's very interesting, not in Luzon, not in Visayas, but actually in Mindanao. He's at 66% in Mindanao, but he's only at 53%, I mean, relatively smaller, and 57% sa NCR. So, geographic vote rich base wise, he's stronger in Mindanao than other places, which we know is really more Sara carrying this. Because Marcos didn't do very well in 2016 elections. And for anyone who has a basic sense of history, alam natin yung parte ng Pilipinas na pinaka nag-suffer nung panahon ng Marcos dictatorship was actually Mindanao. And i-google nyo yan. Wag TikTok ha. I-google nyo, pag-aralan nyo. Hindi, I'm not gonna give a lecture now on the the tragedy of the Mindanao War and how that really affected our country, led to so much disasters, and also yung ating Armed Forces of the Philippines, yung sandatang lakas ng Pilipinas, napakalakas po yan in the 60s. After yung war sa Mindanao, humina na siya. Kasi nga, bug down siya. Eh, sino nagsimula ng war na yan? Paano nag-out of control yung war na yan? Kaninong presidente nag-all-out war dun sa Mindanao? Alam natin yan, di ba? O, kung hindi nyo alam, huwag kayo mag-TikTok, ha? So, a lot of this is Mindanao. And in fact, I wrote in a piece, my column the other week, ang title is Solid South, the secret formula for success of Marcos. Let me give you some numbers again here. Kasi meron kami webinar sa Ateneo de Davao the other week at yung isang kasama namin, si Prof. Abinales from University of Hawaii, Manoa. He raised some very interesting data. So let me just give you some numbers. So his preference rating of Marcos is as high as 73% in Region 12, Central Mindanao, and 69% Region 10, Northern Mindanao. And this is where it gets more interesting. Ang vote share ni Marcos ay mas mataas among Waray, 59%, and Cebuano, 57%. So this is, I think, December last year, than among Tagalog. Again, my understanding here is, a lot of this looks like Sara Duterte rallying behind Marcos. So you go from 13% all the way to what, 60%, 53%. There has to be a proper explanation for that. And I think a big chunk of that is Sara Duterte, Solid South, and the attendant correlative and I would say, what's that? Derivative bandwagoning effect, across the rest of the country, right? Okay, so yon. And in fact, even the most generous, I would say, surveys on variability says that more than 50% of those who said they'll vote for Bong Marcos are still open to changing their mind. Which brings you to the second level of analysis. Now, alam ko yung argument ng yung mga kakamping is that, kung mag-back out ng ibang candidates, may chance si LENI para mag, head-to-head sila ni Bongbong Marcos. Well, guess what? Actually, if you look at the other candidates, especially I would say Lacson, but even more Isko, their overlap is more with Bongbong Marcos than with LENI. So kung mag-withdraw sila, baka papunta palalo kay Bongbong Marcos yan, di ba? Baka abot ng 70% na yan si Marcos, di ba? So you have to be very, very clear about this, no? And so the only way really for Leni Robredo to be able to make this really competitive against Marcos, because her second preference numbers are relatively modest. So you're looking at 30-35%. Maybe that's where it maxes out. The only way is if ISKO picks up at the expense of BBM. That's really the only way I can see reasonably. That this race can be more competitive and potentially three-way race. Let's just look at facts here. I'm just saying, if ever it's going to be more competitive, it will be in a scenario whereby ISKO picks up at the expense of BBM, then it brings it down from 50-60 to around 40 for 30 plus, then Leni pushing it up at 30 plus, and then ISKO, let's say 20, 25, 30, diba? Then that's where the race can be competitive. Is that going to happen? Diba? But that's the roadmap you can only see. And one way that can happen is if Duterte, the father, not the daughter, suddenly throws a curveball and says, hindi talaga ako kay BBM, dito na ako kay ISKO. Right? So yung mga nagbabash kay ISKO na Duterte 2.0, well, the reality is, and stronger ISKO is actually better for Leni, right? And bad for BBM, right? So the best thing for BBM is a weak ISKO, because ISKO is the one losing a lot of numbers to BBM. And ISKO is the top second preference candidate. So he has the most room for improvement. And that improvement is not necessarily at Leni's expense. It's going to be almost, super majority is going to be at the expense of BBM. I don't have the super micro data to definitely say how many percentage points yung overlap niya with BBM. But I can confidently say it's a lot, right? It's a lot. Probably around above 70% overlap. So, ISKO, I think, has more than 20 points to pick up. And a lot of that at the expense of Marcos. So, you can imagine if ISKO, of course, goes all the way, nag-Super Saiyan 5 siya, and nag-convert niya yung 20 points plus yung 8 to 10 points na, then goes all the way to 30, then Marcos will come down all the way to 40, 30 plus. Then Leni still has 10 to 15 points to pick up, so she can go up to 30, 35. That is the only realistic scenario I can see whereby this race gets really, really competitive in ways that it has not been since November, I would say. No? Now, let's look at the surveys also here because it's very interesting. Now, alam ko maraming galit dyan kay ina-attack na naman yung Pulse Asia. I mean, to be fair, Pulse Asia is run by really, really legit people. Ronald Holmes is a good friend, a good colleague. These people are legit, okay? Stop attacking them. Now, remember, the survey of Pulse Asia is kind of mid-ish January, right? So if you look at the SWS survey, that covers a little bit towards the end, lalong-lalo na after ito yung inano si Jessica. So, ganun. Makikita mo, actually, the numbers of Marcos are quite different. Right? Are quite different. Let me just go to the data here. So, wala akong mga production para i-breakdown natin. So, if you look at the SWS one, the one that was commissioned by ADR, from the one I saw, no? So, his numbers are more around 50%, right? Not 60%. And then Leni is around 19 or 20%, right? So the SWS numbers show that the jump is not that significant. Nonetheless, if you look at it, mukhang BBM since October had a +7 net because he was actually 43 back in October. So now he's at 50, not 60, according to another survey. And in the case of Leni, actually, she went from 20 to 19. So the trend lines are not as good for opposition, but not also as prohibitive in favor of Bongbong Marcos. No, so this is the SW survey. Because you have to look at multiple surveys taken in different periods para you have a better idea about how things are happening. But let me pull you another survey. Don't worry, lahat ng mga sinasabi ko dito, ipopost ko yan sa baba. Alright? Don't worry, para pwede nyo titignan. Huwag kayo mag-bash ng surveys and numbers. Kasi anong alternative mo? Yung kolokoy na surveys online? Hindi naman pwede yan. Anong alternative mo? Kwentong barbero? Hindi naman pwede po yan. Although all love to our barbero friends and all. Masarap naman talaga mga kwento namin. But it's not data-driven. But let me give you some other interesting numbers. So, some colleagues of ours, these are legit people, from WR Numero, so sila Dr. Garcia, and International Development and Security Cooperation, a new think tank by Dr. Cabalsa, no? So they did also a study, and their numbers are interesting. Hindi ganun kalayo. So base sa numbers nila, Bongbong Marcos in the first week of January, umabot siya ng 58.89%. So almost 60% siya nung early January. But by the end of the month, bumaba siya sa 50%. So almost a double-digit decline within the month. And we can guess what were the factors. Probably medyo nagkaroon ng konting backlash dito dun sa we know not what, right? Yung mga ayaw magpakita, gusto lang Tony Talks, diba? So yon. So that shows extreme variability. So within a matter of weeks, we saw in January, base dito sa mga ibang studies, especially this one by IDSC and WR Numero, that yes, Marcos is still in a dominant position, but we're looking at double-digit decline within almost just a few weeks, right? So the variability level is so high. So that's a good news for the opposition, that it seems there's a lot of variability, and if you are ISKO, there's also a lot of good hope for you that you can chip away at this variability, especially if the Duterte, comes in and says, no, I want Mindanao to support ISKO, not BBM. Is that highly probable? But is that possible? Is that a reasonable scenario? Yes. But the probability, of course, we can debate about that. And some could say, wishful thinking pa rin yan, diba? And not so good news is Marcos is still garnering around half of the votes. I'm talking about the opposition now. If you're the opposition, then not so good news for you is that Marcos is still in an unprecedented position. We haven't had a candidate with this huge share of the votes this close to the election day, right? So let's see. Now, obviously, in an normal, ideal, whatever, actually, forget about ideal, normal world, the debates could have been a chance for other candidates to expose yung mga weaknesses, especially front runners. But in this case, we have a situation whereby the front runner is saying, ayoko dito, ayoko dyan, ayoko dito, ayoko dyan. Tony talks, mga ganon. So, this a bit limits the room for the other candidates to chip away at the front runner. And the front runner knows exactly that's going to be the case if he enters the debate. So, if you're Lenny, if you're Isko, etc., you have to think about really some solid strategy to maximize this variability in the base of support for Bongbong Marcos. Okay, nakikita ko sa comment section, may mga nagagalit na sa akin, yung mas sinasabi bias, wishful thinking, BBM ka, ganyan ka, ayan na naman tayo sa mga natin dyan, mga